Hello everybody and welcome to this first installment of Washington State History Digital Learning Edition. My name is Mr. Martin and I'll be your host for the next about 8 minutes or so. And today what we're going to be looking at is the beginning of the process of Washington becoming a state. In fact, this week is what we're going to be looking at called the Statehood era, and how Washington goes from this territory that's lumped in with the Oregon Territory and how it becomes its own state about 50 years later. So what we're going to do with this video is I'd like you to take Cornell notes as just a basic foundation. We're going to be answering 4 questions with those Cornell notes. The first one is going to be, and you can put these on the left-hand side of your Cornell notes, that narrower side. The first question that we're going to be looking at here is, what shape does Washington take over time before it becomes a state? Because the state borders that we have now are the state borders that it had in 1889. So what kinds of shapes did it take before it got to these final borders? We need to know that. Another thing that we need to know is why did people come here? What was it that brought people to Washington so that it could become a state in the first place? The other thing we need to know is, who are the people that came here? Who came here, who didn't come here, and then how did they get here? What did that journey look like? And then finally, what happened to the people that were coming here, what happened to the people that lived here for centuries before a lot of these American and European immigrants came over into Washington State? What does life look like for them as Washington becomes a political thing with its current borders? So in your Cornell notes, again, you'll be having those 4 questions on the left-hand side. What does Washington look like as far as like the political borders, the shape of Washington? Why do people come here? Who comes here and how do they get here? And then finally, what happens to the people that were here in the first place? So the first part of looking at Washington State is to look at what shape does Washington take? What we're going to do is we're going to have sort of a timeline piece as you're going through, and I'll show you images of what shape it takes over time, and why does Washington change over this like 50-year period from when it becomes part of the Oregon country all the way to when it becomes Washington State. So if we go back into the early 1800s, there was a lot, as we saw with European contact, there was a lot of contention over who actually controlled this territory. Well, it ends up boiling down. I'm not going to get too far into the original history, but it boils down to Great Britain and the United States laying claim to this region. So in 1827, Great Britain and the United States agree to a joint occupation of the Oregon country. And what that means is that for the entire area, going all the way up into British Columbia and down into modern-day Washington, Idaho, and Oregon, Great Britain and the United States will lay claim to that. And really, that's to keep other places from taking over this territory, especially Russia and Spain. So in 1846, Great Britain is less and less interested in the territory, and so the United States wants to maintain its foothold to access the Pacific and to stop Spain from continuing to move up the coast. And so in 1846, Great Britain and the United States signed the Treaty of Oregon. And this establishes the 49th parallel as the border with Canada, essentially what is today Canada. And so that border is our northern border today. It extends all the way from the Great Lakes over in the east, and it's that sort of straight line that makes up the top of the United States all the way over into what is now near the Strait of Juan de Fuca. In 1848, the United States establishes the Oregon Territory, and in 1848 it is comprised of modern Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and then parts of Montana. Oregon and Washington territories split shortly after that, with Oregon officially becoming a state in 1859. And then Washington's modern borders are established in 1863, but it doesn't become a state until 1889. So our first question that we have to answer when we're looking at Washington become a state is, why did people come to Washington in the first place? What is it that enticed them, again, to make that journey, that sometimes arduous 6-month journey, all the way from the Mississippi River out west to leave whatever they had behind, and what was out here for them? Why would they take such a dangerous and long journey? Well, the first thing that's going to entice people is that they no longer have to fear the violence that was in the area with the conflicts between the United States and the indigenous peoples. So once the Indian Wars were over, there was less of a threat of violence in moving to the area. The United States has decades of propaganda demonizing Native Americans and really instilling some intense fears in people. And so that fear stopped a lot of folks from taking risks and moving out into new spaces. So once the Indian Wars were over and that sort of threat of violence was lessened, people were more likely to move and travel out west. The second thing that we see, the Oregon Trail gets underway in the early 1840s. In 1837, there was called the aptly named Panic of 1837, and it's an economic depression that's going to motivate a lot of people to seek new opportunities because the opportunities where they're living aren't quite there. And we see this a lot in United States history, people moving to new areas for economic opportunities, and this is one of them. The Oregon Trail is, as I said before, a pretty intense 6-month journey in the 1840s. But with so many people moving out west between 1840 and the late 1860s, that trip goes from 6 months to 4 months, still very tough. But we see more and more people being willing to take this trip as the risks of going on the journey go down. We start seeing more infrastructure being put together, the roads become wagon safe. You start to see ferry systems that are pretty reliable being able to cross rivers. And so people are more likely to move over into the West. Now, the United States really wants people to move out west. So how can the United States motivate people to go out and put feet on the ground out in the West? Because if you remember, Spain had laid claim to a lot of this territory in like the 1600s, but it didn't really have any oomph to it because there's nobody here from Spain to say this is our land. They simply planted the flag and said this is our land. Well, the United States really wanted to establish sort of a stronghold to prevent, in particular, Spain from the south and Russia from the north from taking over this territory, because Oregon and Washington represent an outlet to the Pacific Ocean from the Atlantic. So they really wanted that sort of across the continent control. So the United States creates 2 laws in order to get people to move out west, and both of them have to do with land, because land is a huge source of opportunity for people moving out west. The first one is the Donation Land Claim Act, and that is intended to get people to move in particular to the Oregon Territory. Since there was already like Fort Vancouver and along the Columbia River. The Columbia River was really important, and there's already some folks that were starting to establish themselves in Oregon. The United States really tried to push people into that Oregon Territory, and that's one of the reasons why Oregon becomes a state so quickly in 1859, is because there's sort of enough of a rolling economy in order to make Oregon a state. In 1862, 12 years later, there's a series of homestead acts that are enacted. And what these do is they, again, offer land to people out west. So the Homestead Act of 1862 is going to say, if you come to Washington State and you put your feet on the ground and you take over, you take care of some land, this land will then be yours. So it's a tremendous economic opportunity for people to kind of like start fresh, to establish themselves in this new frontier that they see moving out west. And so a lot of people are willing to take the risk of that journey in order to get that land. So then the question is, who are the people that are taking this risk, that are taking this chance? And most of the people that are coming over are American citizens. They're white American citizens. And they are white American citizens who have some sort of means, especially to make the journey. So in addition to the white Americans that are moving out here and taking over a lot of these tracts of land, are European immigrants, especially Scandinavians, Irish, Italian immigrants are also coming over here to take advantage of a lot of this land that's being essentially given away by the United States government. You're also going to start to see some Chinese populations moving out into the West and into Washington Territory, primarily for mining. However, you'll start to see the Chinese population increase, especially with the railroads that are being built, because a lot of American railroads are going to be built by Chinese labor over the 1800s. And this is going to cause some interesting social dynamics and social conflicts in the 1800s in Western Washington. And so we'll be looking at that later on this week. One group that we don't see a lot of at this time are African Americans coming from the East and moving out into the West. Primarily, even though the Homestead Act specifically says that African Americans can take advantage of this opportunity because of discrimination and because of local laws that specifically target African Americans and ban them from being able to own property in some of these local territories, they aren't able to take advantage of this incredible opportunity of free land. And so that's one reason why we don't see a huge wave of African American movement up here. They are going to stay entrenched in the South for a variety of reasons, including slavery. So even though slavery ends, because of a number of different reasons, they're going to stay in the South. We're going to get to a lot of that in a few weeks when we start talking about sort of the demographics of Washington State and why they are the way that they are. So we'll see eventually a large migration of African Americans into Western Washington, but it's not going to happen here with this Free Land Act. Now, the last question is, what happens to a lot of the people, all of the people really, that were living here for centuries before white Americans get here, and a lot of those Europeans also, and essentially because of the military losses of the Indian Wars, and because a lot of the cultural and social fabric that was established here for so long just gets broken, and they don't have the means. They're being wiped out by disease and by the superior military of the Americans. And so ultimately they have two options after America starts to take over a lot of these territories. They can either stay in like white areas and assimilate, meaning like conform to American styles and American language and American religion, which in this case equals Protestant and Catholic Christianity, or they can go to reservations. And so today, I'm sure that you've heard of a lot of reservations in Washington, Yakima, Tulalip, Muckleshoot. There's a lot of different, lots of different tribes all around Washington. Very small reservations. So if you, a lot of these people that relied on a way of life that moved around a lot, like those nomadic ways of life, could no longer really do so because they were confined to a small area. So the nomadic way of life and way of living is pretty much not an option for a lot of these groups anymore. And a lot of the land that they got for reservations weren't really economically viable. They couldn't really take advantage of the natural resources there. And so what we see is a economic sort of downward spiral for a lot of these tribal groups. So even though the reservations are still there today, the legacy of that reservation system lives on. You don't see a lot of economic success with a lot of these groups because of what they were left with after a lot of the Americans take over. So we'll be getting into that a little bit more toward the end of the year. And what I'd like you to do when I'm talking about economic resources, last thing I want you to do is to add to your Cornell notes sort of one of the reasons why people came here. I'd like you to read just 2 pages, pages 236 and 237 in your notes. And I want you to add to the Cornell notes that you have taken today. It could be on the bottom section if you have some room, or just flip over to the next page. And I want you to identify what are the sort of major economic or natural resources that people can take advantage of. Because that's going to be another reason why people are going to end up coming to Washington, is that there are a ton of natural resources here in the state that they can then take advantage of. So if you would, please read 236 and 237. I'm going to have a couple of questions up on a discussion page up on the Schoology site. So if you go into our class, you can answer just a couple of questions in the discussion site right there. So thank you very much, everybody, for listening to this first attempt at producing a video. Hopefully they'll get better over time. This is a learning process for me as well. But I appreciate you spending some time with me today, and hopefully I'll be able to see you all very soon. Bye.